When you look at the technology that it has, it was a technological marvel in its heyday. But I mean, I wholeheartedly agree that when you get into a more modern sports car with the all time all wheel drive, an actual traction control system, or an ABS system that functions, it's easy to see that the Skyline does have some Achilles heels that you kind of have to drive through them.
Welcome to the HPA Tuned In podcast. I'm Andre, your host, and in this episode, we're joined by Josh Ray from Driver Motorsports. Now, Josh has got a really interesting backstory here, how he transitioned a 20 plus year career in the Navy, specifically working on F-14 fighter jets, among other things, into a career now as a professional tuner and mechanic for Driver Motorsports, building some of the fastest and highest spec JDM builds in North America. Now, one of the takeaways for me from this particular episode was Josh's never say die attitude. There's an old saying that if you want something bad enough, you'll find a way, and if you don't want it bad enough, you'll find an excuse, and nothing could be closer to home with Josh's story, specifically where he didn't really have money or budget to train traditionally as a mechanic. But he found that the armed forces offer the ability to train while you're actually getting paid. Before we get into our conversation with Josh, for those who are new to the Tuned In podcast, High Performance Academy is an online training school. We specialize in teaching people how to tune EFI, how to build performance engines, how to create custom, reliable wiring harnesses. We also cover topics on race car setup, race driver education, fabrication, and data analysis, just to name a few. You will find a full list of all of our courses at hpacademy.com/courses. Our courses are all video based. You can take them from anywhere in the world, provided you've got an internet connection, and our courses never expire. Once you purchase one, it's yours for life. Watch it as many times as you like. And as an added bonus, because you are a podcast listener, you get to use the coupon code podcast75. That will get you $75 off the purchase of your very first HPA course. We'll put a link to that coupon code as well as our courses in the show notes to make it super easy for you to find. All right, enough with our introduction. Let's get into our interview now. All right, welcome to the show, Josh. Thanks for joining us today. And like always, let's start by learning a little bit about your background. How did you get interested in cars and when did that happen?
I think like most guys that are into cars, like saw something, whether it be a movie or they had a family member that was into something. For me, it was my dad, who was kind of I'll say a backyard mechanic, where we weren't very wealthy. So being able to work on cars was a skill set that, he was very adamant about passing to me. So, it started with just routine upkeep and keeping vehicles running and serviceable. And then he had a keen eye for like factory modified vehicles. So if it was for him to fix it, it was to upgrade it to what a factory modified vehicle would be. And then I just kind of took it one step further, being that I kind of grew up in the height of the Fast and the Furious era where everything needed to be modified. It had to have all the lights and bling and stuff. So I was hooked into that kind of stuff.
When you use that term factory modified, are you talking about sort of just a higher spec of the same car that rolled off the showroom floor? Is that what you're sort of meaning?
Correct. Yeah. So like he would basically find vehicles for a steal of a price and would return them to basically stock. But if the dealer offered a higher trim package, he would basically create the higher trim package from other, vehicles basically. So
Okay.
salvage cars into creating, for example, like you buy like a Mustang GT and then turn it into a Cobra,
Sure.
adding those upgrades.
All right, so it sounds like you're getting a basic schooling here in mechanics from your dad. How did this sort of grow into more of a career path that you're intent to go down?
So I liked working with my hands, and I can remember at a young age, like, taking my bicycle apart and wanting to upgrade things and just kind of figuring out, how bearings and sprockets and things like that worked and what gear ratios would make your bike faster. And as I got older and, had friends that picked up things like, motorbikes and such, it just seemed like the level of progression. So, buying some cheap tools or having some hand-me-down tools, we just kind of self-taught, self-learned. But going through high school, I thought about pushing on to be a architect or something with some engineering. And again, just not from a wealthy family, couldn't go to a formal education, formal college. And I basically decided that the military was going to be my opportunity to get that education. So at the young age of 17, with my parents' permission, I enlisted in the United States Navy and was basically employed as a fighter jet mechanic. So engines and fuel systems were my specialty in the Navy.
Sounds like probably the closest or next best thing to being Maverick, actually flying the jets.
That's it. And funny enough, I worked on the F-14s that were in the first Top Gun movie, decommissioned those, and then I was actually a extra in the movie Top Gun Maverick. So I was paid as an extra to be in that movie during that filming sequence.
Not a bad claim to fame. I think that original Top Gun movie really transformed a generation of people, particularly my generation, with a certain love for aviation and the Navy in general. Now, I think probably to get a little off track here, but if you look at the Navy, the Air Force, etc., people sort of look at that from the outside and think it's all about defending your country, which is obviously a noble task anyway. But as you've sort of alluded to here, there's more to it than just being on the front line, actually fighting, and there are some valid trades that come out of this where, as I understand it, at least the armed forces will teach you those skills in return for your service.
That's right. So oftentimes, again, when you can think of any job in the outside world, there is a job similar in the armed forces where we have technicians that work on diesel engines. We have technicians that work on gas turbine engines. We have electricians. I mean, again, dumbing it down, but we have, basic carpenters and plumbers and equipment operators, like you name it, they do it. So that's obviously a trade that they're going to teach us to do. And then there's lots of hands-on learning that comes with that, but you do go to formal schools. And then kind of the perk to the military side of the house is that they will pay for our education beyond what that of our trade is. So basically, it's more lucrative for us to learn the trade in the Navy or armed forces, period, and apply that towards after education and then look for a career field once we transition away from, that military service.
Sure. All right, so I'm just sort of wanting to join the dots here between decommissioning F-14 fighter jets and what you're doing now. So obviously there's a crossover with mechanical skills, but I'm going to guess the F-14 side of things probably goes a little bit above and beyond what you're doing these days. So yeah, how did that all transition?
So during the same time that I was working as a aircraft mechanic for the Navy, I was still super interested in cars. I enlisted in the Navy in 2000. Obviously, at that time, I say obviously, but we weren't at a time of war as far as the Americas were until our World Trade Center was hit. So I had only been in the Navy about a year. And at that time, it was just like, oh no, like what's going to happen? The world's crumbling around us. And, I did 22 years in the Navy. So pretty much my entire time, there was some sort of conflict after, 9/11. And the only thing that kept me kind of going was my car passion. Being a professional mechanic in the aviation industry was wonderful. It was a great skill set. I had access to lots of technology, lots of tools, but I learned bare bones principles, how to use a torque wrench, how to take precision measurements, and just understand that, maintenance excellence is a way of life. It's not like these ladies and gentlemen flying airplanes can pull over when the check engine light comes on, you know. So for us down here, it's, we apply that same skill set to, hey, something goes wrong with the vehicle. Yeah, we have the luxury to pull it over, but less likely. So that was really my transition, was just the cars were my outlet to be able to, blow off some steam, express myself, personally, emotionally. And it was just a hobby. That's really what it was.
Just talking about the check engine light and pulling over to the side of the sky, obviously not a valid option. On that basis, coming through that training in the aviation industry, is it safe to assume you sort of get trained and taught to work at a higher level of precision just to make sure that there is no real room for error?
That is, probably the easiest way to describe it is that we do have to operate at that higher level. And we do tremendous amount of training knowing that human error is typically the contributing factor to a mishap. And, on times where we're working 12, 14 plus hour days, if I didn't get a good night's rest, or I missed meals, or I wasn't necessarily trained to an extreme on a certain, discrepancy that we're working on, Mistakes can absolutely be made, but it's kind of defined into our ethos, if you will, that I can never inspect my own work. That if I'm the hands-on technician, then you are my inspector. And if it requires a third set of eyes, we'll have a quality assurance representative come look at it again to, two-person verify that, hey, it's torqued properly, it's inspected, it's not leaking because, again, those folks in the air don't have the luxury of pull over. Not to mention that, if they were in a direct fight and they're worrying about being shot or, going down somewhere, that they're never going to come home. They need to know that their equipment is going to keep them safe.
I mean, I think a lot of that ethos could transition quite nicely into the automotive industry, where unfortunately more often than not I do see a more slapdash slash she'll be right approach, and while yes we can pull over if something goes wrong, it's still not the desired outcome. Let's talk a little bit more about this passion for cars that was building. What are you actually doing in the automotive scene at this point? What sort of cars are you working on? What are you driving? Are these daily drivers just to get you from point A to B? Are you actually involved in any formal motorsports, be it legal or maybe otherwise?
So I think the illegal type stuff, as far as racing cars and such, I did do at a younger age. It was a kind of a slippery slope. Being active duty military, if I was to get in trouble, the government gets involved, and that would kind of make you forced to keep your nose clean, so to speak. So I did spend much more time on track. I did spend more time going to major shows and events and things like that. That just kept me, always looking for what's the next modification. So as far as, things that I'm driving now, I've been a diehard, Nissan fan since probably 2001, where I purchased a 1998 200 SX, the B14 chassis here in the States. That thing had every rendition. It was like an audio car, and it had air ride equipment, and then it had, crazy body kits and lights and such. Because again, following like that Fast and the Furious trend, it was the things that I could bolt onto a car in my driveway, more so where I couldn't necessarily pay a performance shop to do big things to it. So having big dreams and big goals, I've owned a tremendous amount of vehicles. I had an 88 FC RX-7 for a little while that was nothing but just finicky problems, and I thought I could handle a rotary at the time, and it was just like, okay, this thing's too much for me.
You wouldn't be the only one.
Oh, I hear that. And around 2008 timeframe, I picked up the Nissan 300ZX, the 1991, that belonged to my best friend who had passed away in a motorcycle accident. And to me, it was build that car as a tribute to him. And that kind of kept me in the tuner scene for a while. And then probably for the last 15 years, before the Skyline had come legal, I had made deployments to Japan and had been overseas where Skylines were a thing when they were roughly new cars, within, 8 years old, 10 years old kind of thing. And I fell in love with the R32 GTR. And basically, Facebook does a good job of reminding me all the time, like, hey, 15 years ago, I said I want a GTR. And, I'd tell my wife that every year on that anniversary. And then one day she said, hey, whatever, it's your money. And within 24 hours, I had it in the driveway. So that was like 2016.
Just needed that seal of approval.
That was it, So like 2016 timeframe, I basically used an importer to get my personal 91 R32 GTR. So I still have that car to this day, and big things happening with it now that, again, I'm retired from the military and working in a facility like Driver Motorsports, where I get access to things that I wouldn't normally have been able to achieve.
Absolutely. All right, let's go back and dig in on a few of these things. So it's coming back, while it's a little off our topic today, that Top Gun movie I already said, I think that sort of formed an aviation passion for a huge generation of people coming through, just like Top Gun did for the aviation industry. I think it's fair to say that the Fast and the Furious franchise did exactly the same for that automotive scene. And it sounds like that drove your passion for the JDM platform as opposed to going down the more conventional for someone stateside of US domestic market models.
That's right. So I think really what started my import trending was cost. So my dad would get muscle cars, whether it be, Ford, Chevy, Dodge, it didn't really matter. He would come across these deals, and he was, I would say, like a builder of fortune, where if he got a good deal on a Dodge, he'd buy a Dodge. He wasn't necessarily brand loyal. So I kind of had the luxury of not having to be brand loyal. But the very first car I ever purchased on my own was actually a Volkswagen. And I kept with the VWs for a long time, thinking that this was going to be, my weapon of choice. And just the wiring, the gremlins that the old 80s Volkswagens would have basically were turning my pockets inside out. And I was already working on such a fixed income as a young student before the military. I had to abandon that. And then once I started making, government money is when I got into the Nissan.
Okay. Now, you mentioned the sort of progression from the 200SX to the 300Z. I had, I'm sorry to say, the misfortune of working on a few 300Zs in my time. And while when they're going, they're an absolute, amazing platform. What I would say from a mechanic's perspective is if you need to do anything more than check the oil, they cram so much into that engine bay that they're an absolute nightmare to work on. So I'd have to say I hold some resent towards that platform, unfortunately. A few skin knuckles and lost a little bit of blood over those cars. Moving on to the GTR though, that's become a fan favourite. And on this side of the world, the R32 GTR sort of came to the top of the heap essentially because of its involvement in the Australian Touring Car Championship, and basically it dominated all, got the nickname Godzilla. So I kind of understand the passion for the R32 GTR and specifically across that platform, the different generations. On this side of the world, in the US, though, it kind of seems a little bit less tied to that. I'm guessing probably weren't too many in the US watching the Australian Touring Car Championship in the early 90s. So how did that GTR become such a fan favourite over there?
I think, as many times I've heard people talk historically about America and the Skyline presence, again, futuristic technology, video games was kind of the thing. So I playing on a PlayStation platform and the Gran Turismo game came out, and next thing you know, there's a Skyline on there and it's just dominating and it's such a fast car. You'd start to think like, man, like, what is this thing? And you try to do some research. Well, at that time in my life, internet wasn't a thing, so I got most of my media through, paper magazines, so I could remember going and picking up the Import Tuner magazine, the Super Street magazine. And then every now and again, we would find someone that would carry stuff from like the Japan Auto Salon. And that's when I really started seeing Skylines personally. So I'd see them in the magazines, I'd see these overseas builds. Again, it seemed like such a cool car. And I was so dead set on having one that even with the 200SX that I did a R33 front end conversion on it in probably 2007, something so odd. Because I knew I couldn't get the car, I was going to make it look like it,
Get the next best thing.
That's it.
It's interesting just being involved with that particular platform through my old business. It was a popular car for modification, and it is a relatively easy one to, at least at a base level, get a significant increase in power. I'm interested in your thoughts now. I'm guessing maybe you're a little bit biased. I try and keep a fairly open mind. I still absolutely love the R32 GTR, and it's one that I've still got on my bucket list to own. However, what I would say is that in comparison to maybe some of the more modern offerings, when you actually get into one of those R32 GTRs in this day and age, I kind of think they show their lack of technology and their lack of refinement. And I'll give you a bit of an analogy to this is we did a full worked example tuning an R32 GTR for a good friend of ours. Absolutely immaculate example, and it was fairly basic, just some bolt-on turbos, exhaust, intercooler, and I think it had a Link plug-and-play ECU in it. So nothing wild. Might have made around 400 kilowatts at the wheels or thereabouts. And as part of that, I actually ended up taking it to our local racetrack to do some media shots and some videos for our marketing. And it involved a couple of sort of relatively sort of low speed, sort of maybe 7/10 laps around the track. And sort of the first time I got into a corner and gave it partial throttle, before I knew it, the thing's completely crossed up sideways and I'm sort of coming out of the corner, albeit with a massive grin on my face with half a turn of opposite lock and smoke pouring off the rear tyres. And I'm sort of thinking to myself, if I just look at the Mitsubishi Evo platform, which was kind of my specialty at the point, there'd just be no fuss. You'd just be driving out of the corner, probably faster, no tyre smoke, no squealing, nothing to worry about. And, that comparison of a full-time four-wheel drive platform versus the R32's predominantly rear-wheel drive with the ability to send torque to the front. How do you think it's dated, or aged, I should say?
So I would say that, when you look at the technology that it has, from 80s and 90s, it was a technological marvel in its heyday. But I mean, I wholeheartedly agree that when you get into a more modern sports car with, the all-time all-wheel drive, well, I shouldn't say more, but like an actual traction control system or an ABS system that functions, it's easy to see that the Skyline does have some Achilles heels that you kind of have to drive through them. So I definitely joked about it with my Z and said, "Hey, the Z taught me to be a great mechanic because it's such a painful thing to work on." Nissan did stick the most massive engine in that bay that they possibly could. And what I really enjoy about having both the 91 300Z and the GTR, they're so familiar. So between the V6 and the inline six, I truly believe it made me a better GTR mechanic just because, again, it's such a familiar platform to me now. But again, when I drive these cars that come to the shop and they're in like bone stock configuration, it is very dull. It's like, man, like,
I'll admit the first time I drove a stock standard one, no modifications at all, I kind of came back to the shop thinking, what is all this fuss about? But then you do just the
yeah,
simple bolt-ons that I
yeah,
mentioned, the exhaust, the intake, tune, a little bit more boost,
yeah.
and oh, okay, now I see what people are talking about.
Yeah, and I think with a lot of those cars, it does that. Give it a little bit more, it'll respond.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move back because we've sort of got a little bit off course here. So let's kind of join the dots up between getting out of the military and what you're doing today. Sort of how did that path progress?
So I was this was like 2020 pre-COVID. I was getting ready to go on a deployment, and with the internet being what it is, YouTube videos and such like that was just kind of what was keeping me occupied while I was waiting to leave. And Driver Motorsports, maintaining their YouTube channel, watched a funny video on them doing some stuff to a car, and at the end they posted a flyer saying that they were looking to hire a mechanic. And that kind of had my interest peaked, but I was thinking, well, man, I'm not getting out for another couple of years, not a big deal, but it's in my hometown, so wouldn't mind actually, maybe heading back that direction when my time in the military was up. So I left for that deployment, all the while keeping an eye on what they were doing, because at the time that I was living where they're located now, it didn't exist. So there weren't any import tuner shops. There was a couple of hot rod shops and a couple of specialty shops, but you had to go to the coast, so the Virginia Beach area or the Carolina areas, to find people that specialized in import cars. Well, watching their videos, and I was hooked. I was like, I can't believe this is in my little town. So fast forward a year, the world was overtaken by COVID, and I just basically was like, look, the military is coming to a close for me. What's next? And I saw another YouTube video from Driver Motorsports saying they were hiring a mechanic. And at this point, I was like, I got to figure this out. So I fired up a resume. I emailed it off to the company. And, oddly enough, while I was in COVID lockdown waiting to deploy again, is the first time I'd found your channel. So the HP Academy stuff. And I actually enrolled in just a tuning fundamentals course. And my main logic in that is I'd been street tuning cars. I was never operating as a professional tuner, but I've seemed to have a good knack for it. And I wanted to know if what I was doing was right or wrong, or maybe reinforce the skill set that I had kind of self taught with something that seemed to be more formal. And I had completed a couple of those courses. And at the end, when you get your little certificate printed out, I actually included those in my resume to Driver Motorsports. And, I get a phone call from Chris, the owner, and he's reading over the stuff and seeing my military experience and my managerial skills and all this stuff that I've been doing, my portfolio of cars built that were personal builds. And he was just like, man, this is wonderful, and all I can really say is I can't afford you. And I remember not putting a salary request in my resume, mainly because I knew that I was retiring from the military. I was going to receive a retirement pension, that my family would be okay. I wasn't necessarily worried about that bottom dollar. Although I do want a competitive wage at the same time, I wasn't asking for millions. So I said that to him, and he was like, look, when can you be here? And I was like, well, I don't retire for another year. So this again is like 2021 timeframe. But my unit that I was assigned to allowed me to take a month of leave, being we had come back from a deployment. So it was longer than they would let most people do it. But because I was retiring, I had a lot of leave days accrued or vacation days. They allowed me to take a month off, and I flew from California to Virginia and was working to basically show them my skill set. And in about that 30 days, I had assembled some engines. I had, built a couple of cars, assembled one that had been on the property for a long time. Kind of shameless plug is going to be in the show Banging Gears. Like, it's already been filmed, it's sequenced. So, car that I had my hands on is now going to be on mainstream TV. And yeah, I mean, that was it. After that month, Chris took me out to dinner and was like, "Hey man, when can you be here full time? Like, I got to have you, And I was like, "Well, this is my current retirement date. I'm waiting on my replacement." Military does something kind of fancy with that, where if you have a very unique skill set, you can't leave until the next person kind of fills in the blank. So my replacement hadn't been identified yet. And once that person was identified, they kind of let me, transition out. And now I'm here.
Okay. Again, bunch of stuff to dive into on that. So obviously you've got these qualifications through the Navy, but again, we've sort of talked about this as in the aviation side of things. Do you have any formal qualifications then in the automotive industry, or is it just a close enough tie-in between that and what you've been personally doing with your own cars that Driver Motorsports were like, yeah, hey, this guy knows what he's up to. We don't need any further qualifications beyond that?
Certainly. So when I was leaning on leaving the military and started looking at what my next profession was going to be, cars was always a, viable option. So I wasn't thinking that I was going to go to a tuning shop. I figured I would be working at, a dealership, doing routine service work and such like that. So I was using, the Navy's education benefits to study formal education and get credentials towards the Automotive Service Excellence or ASE certifications that we have. So I am a certified master technician as far as, maintenance and dealership type vehicle upkeep would be concerned.
So I'm interested, obviously, if you go down that franchise dealership path, then I could see that being probably a prerequisite, absolutely essential, ticking that box. I mean, coming from the fact that I owned and ran a performance workshop for 13 years, the fact that I personally have no formal qualifications as a mechanic, I kind of see that for the tuning industry, the performance automotive industry, this is less of a concern to me as a business owner or a past business owner. And more important to me is I want to see someone who can demonstrate those skills, be it on their own vehicles or, like you said, I mean, you sounds like you did basically a month trial and could demonstrate that skill set anyway. I take it you sort of feel similar?
Yeah, so when I was studying those things, there's a lot to be desired still. So learning from a textbook doesn't give you, the ability to really perform as a mechanic. Like, you may have the theoretical knowledge, but it doesn't mean that you can put that into action. So another program that the Navy offered, we have basically, it's a Department of Labor certification where we will do on the job training and gain those journeyman or apprentice level certificates. So while I was formally studying, automotive mechanics, I was also demonstrating by logging hours and such that were being certified and signed off on as a journeyman level automotive technician. So I did have tons of hands-on experience in the formal trade, but then I had also been building my own personal cars with trial and error, and I was able to kind of put together a portfolio of, hey, look, these are the cars that I've built. I still own it to this day. It's still running. It's got multiple track records. And, I've took my show car series, one trophy's taller than me, so I'd kind of been around the industry long enough that I think that was more valuable to Chris when it came to hiring me, is that, the proof was in the pudding. He could see, real world what I had built, and, my technical ability shined through. I have this knowledge base, I have this technical trade, but most importantly, I had the integrity, like, if I don't know something, to speak up, to get educated on it.
It's interesting you say that, because one of the objections that we quite often hear about our online training courses is that you can't teach XYZ topic, whatever that may be, engine tuning, engine building. More often, we're actually starting to get that in the TIG welding and the fabrication side of things. You cannot teach this topic with an online video. And of course, we don't claim that you take one video course and you'll come out the end a professional engine builder or tuner or whatever that may be. I mean, that's obviously nonsense. And we're quite clear about this within the courses. I mean, the old story is 10,000 hours of hands-on experience is what you need to achieve expert level in any particular skill set. And these are no different. And what we try and do with the courses is basically fast track that process, because the way I see it is anything you want to do, be it a mechanic or an engine tuner, it involves, first of all, a deep understanding of the topic and what you're trying to achieve. And that's what we teach with the courses, as well as then providing a step-by-step process that you can apply. But make no mistake, from there on, it's still, you actually require time on that laptop keyboard to put these skills into action and build that muscle memory and have it become second nature. But it blows my mind that we still get these objections. We're not saying that this is the only step that you need to take in order to be a professional tuner again. I mean, the interesting one in terms of the fabrication we're getting is a lot of people with TIG welding experience say, yeah, you don't need that course or anything to learn how to TIG weld. You can find all that information in a book. Well, yeah, okay, well, our course is kind of a lot like a book, but delivered in a video form. So yeah, I don't see that objection. And then they'll say, well, I just got in there and did it, and I just learned. You don't need any of that information. It's like, well, yeah, absolutely. There's plenty of people who have learned to TIG weld with nothing more than the TIG machine and a lot of time, but I can guarantee you're going to waste a huge amount of time, because these modern TIG welders, particularly if you're welding some specific materials like alloy, there's a lot of settings that you need to understand, and understanding those settings, the techniques, the skills, the materials, the consumables, everything you need to know, that's going to dial your technique in quicker and get you up to speed so you can actually put in valuable time practicing. But I digress. Now, I'm interested in learning a little bit more about your experience with the engine tuning side of things, because this is a little bit more difficult, and really this is why High Performance Academy was founded. I mean, as you've mentioned, you can go through and become a qualified mechanic, but there's no formal qualification path that makes you an EFI tuner, and that's why I think we see such a varied range of results in the tuning industry. And by varied, I mean most of them sadly are garbage, because you can buy a dyno and call yourself a tuner. So you mentioned you started street tuning, you were self-taught. So how did that experience sort of pan out before you found our tuning courses?
So for me, some of the cars that I was working with in the very early stages, whether they were a carbureted engine, which I was familiar with rebuilding those things and learning how to make adjustments, I was taught enough fundamental of that to be dangerous. If you have this much air and this much fuel, you can, this much timing advance. And, so I learned enough to be dangerous. When I got a hold of a car that had a piggyback style ECU where I could basically just kind of turn some knobs and it would increase or decrease fuel. That's really all I could get away with. We'd start, messing with distributor caps, or we'd, start advancing timing mechanically. And we started noticing that, like, hey, the car is more responsive. The car is accelerating much quicker, or hey, now it's really sluggish up top, but it's really fast down low. Like, we just kind of figured out a recipe that, the only racetrack we had local to us was an 1/8 mile track. And we found through rudimentary tuning, adding a little bit of fuel here and a little bit of advance there, we were picking up, a little bit of time in that 1/8 mile racing. So it wasn't long before friends of mine who had a little more money than I did were able to buy a little more advanced, stuff. And when I say more advanced, I'm talking like the Power FC, the 1988 RX-7 that I had a Power FC.
In fairness, those Power EFCs they're advanced for their time. Sure, the modern crop of EFI systems makes them look pretty basic, but in their time, I think they still did a really good job.
Absolutely. So that was one of the first tuning platforms that I actually got my hands on, that, I got a hold of a laptop that had the software, and I really was able to kind of dig in and learn what little changes did. And again, because I'm of the age that everything was on paper prior to, like, I didn't have the internet growing up like a lot of, our young technicians have now. So a lot of my learning came from books. Like, I 100% remember checking out from a public library an EFI tuning fundamentals book. and it talked about, the stoichiometric ranges and all these things that, that are so easily spelled out in your videos that, I would see these words and I'm like, I don't even know what that is. Like, I can't pronounce it. Like, you know, but I would learn those principles. And then, being that I had a car with that system, I could go in and like, okay, now I understand what volumetric efficiency is. Like, it just is words that didn't make sense to me on paper, but when I could, plug a number into a screen and see the car react, then I really started catching a handle for it. And, it just got more addicting from there and there. So.
All right, so as you sort of built more in your EFI tuning skill set, I'm guessing at some point you moved on from street tuning and actually started using a dyno and more advanced ECUs?
So more advanced ECUs, yes. By way of I started having friends with the AEM, the Infinities, the really old stuff. I say old stuff now comparatively, but I had never tuned on a dyno. There was not one within probably 4 or 5 hours drive. And if I was ever in a location where there was one, the cost was so far out of my reach, or most shops would not even allow me to tune my own, like rent the dyno, for example. So that was just, hey, I see the value in it, but yeah, we're just not going to use it. So it was all street tuning. And it wasn't until I began working at Driver Motorsports that I actually got my hands on a dyno and was able to, just study and learn how to make that thing, improve my tuning capabilities.
It sounds like your sort of career path mirrors a lot of what I did myself back when I first got started. Yeah, I was young, had no money, definitely had no money for a dyno. At that time, dynos were still pretty much a rarity anyway. They were hugely expensive, and I think local to me there was one dyno, which ultimately I did end up a little later in my career hiring out. But to start with, I was solely street tuning. And this is another objection we hear come up quite regularly, is that you can't do a good job of tuning a car on the road. And I think this is not a black and white question or not a black and white answer. I mean, there's levels to this. And I mean, ultimately, I'd say, yes, if you want to be able to guarantee you're getting the absolute most out of an engine, then of course the dyno is going to give you that feedback. If an extra degree of timing gave you another 2 horsepower, or maybe you lost 2 horsepower, things that you're never going to be able to feel through the seat of the pants dyno. It's been proven to be pretty inaccurate. But I mean, I think, the number of people that need that last 2 horsepower versus those who want to get 90% of the power that the car is capable of producing, the last 2 horsepower people, that's the minority, not the majority. So I think you can still do a reasonable job. Do you agree with that statement?
I 100% agree with that. Again, if a car can be pushed on the street and it's responding and driving and you enjoy what it's doing, then yeah, maybe, I would like to know how much horsepower it is. But then again, you can tell a lot about a vehicle by, what its, mile an hour is going down a drag strip based on time. You can kind of formulate that. People are really good at calculating that stuff now. But back then you could see, if I run this vehicle, which is tuned, against that vehicle, which is not, and they're the exact same vehicle, and this one's half a second faster, obviously what I did works.
Yeah, I think that kind of gets also into a very sort of grey area of dyno sheets and bragging rights for dyno numbers, which I've seen through my whole career. I mean, there's a whole industry built on big dyno sheet numbers, so people have got bragging rights for internet battles, which, I mean, I just try not to get interested in at all or involved in. But what people don't understand is, you can, within reason, a lot of dynos, you can basically make them say whatever number you want. But if you take the thing to the drag strip, as you pointed out there, for those who know what they're looking at, by the time you know some basics about the car, like the weight, you look at the mile an hour, that mile an hour is really going to tell you just about everything you need to know in terms of what that car is actually producing. So the old story, when the flag drops, the bullshit stops, and it really is pretty true. All right, so let's get deeper into your position with Driver Motorsports, and let's actually start by getting a bit of an overview. We've talked about Driver Motorsports a bunch of times, but haven't really dialed into what exactly it is. So can you give us like the 30,000 foot view? What is the company? What services does it offer? Where is it located? Number of staff, size of facility, etc.
So yeah, Driver Motorsports has been technically in business since about 2014. Chris Driver, his last name is Driver, which a lot of people get blown away when they think Driver Motorsports is clever, but it's his name.
It makes more sense now.
Yep. He basically was involved in racing. Him and I had a lot of mutual friends growing up, but we didn't know each other, which is very odd because we were both kind of racing, drag racing and such around the same timeline. But he decided that he was going to get into the import business and partnered with one or two people. And it was a very, very small operation. But most notably, they were bringing in the R32 GTRs. And again, we were talking about it earlier on that, these cars were probably between 10 and 12,000 US dollars, at that time. And then he was selling them between 15, 18, $20,000. And now we're talking 50, 60, $70,000 up. The market's it's just ridiculous. The supply and demand is too much. Well, so as he kind of gained success in doing that, he outgrew one facility and then moved to another and then hired some more staff. So initially he was not doing any upgrades. It was simply import the vehicle, give it a safety check, make sure that it has a valid and legal, United States title or state title. We have no emissions issues here in our state. States like Washington or California that have emissions like these cars would not be legal there because of the added state requirements, but they are legal here once they turn 25 years old. Basically, it wasn't upgrade the cars. It was just routine, make sure they're good. If there was any, physical wear and tear damage, if it needed tires or suspension, they would do those things. Fast forward another year or two, they had gained some notoriety in the import business. And at that point started doing a little more for customers. So again, you would source a vehicle through them. And if you decided you wanted different wheels, different suspension, a bolt-on exhaust, those are the kind of things that they would do. So again, it wasn't big brand build shop. It was just, hey, we can source you some parts, we can source you the car, and we'll assemble it to your liking and you come pick it up. Again, just kind of morphed a little bit more. People started getting more descriptive in the things that they wanted, and the car builds got a little more intense. So, we hired on some more staff, a couple of people that have been building cars for a while that not necessarily formally educated, master technicians, but had been building cars and tuning cars. And then he decided, look, if we're going to be a tuner shop, we got to go all in. And that's when he, decided to purchase a dyno, and they increased the facility size. So now we're two pretty large buildings. I don't know the square footage off the top of my head, but it's two total entities now where it's a entire car dealership of JDM import vehicles. And then we have a secondary, which we've kind of dubbed as Fabland, where we do full custom high-end builds, much like the Rival 32 build that you saw at SEMA, where customers, like Brad, the owner of that car, 2019 timeframe, reached out, sourced that Skyline through us, and had some build options he wanted to go through. And obviously through the COVID and some of the stuff that I had talked to you about while we were at SEMA, it prolonged that build. And then we were able to, keep going. So his car is not the only one that we've done things like that on. So now we're a team of 3 in Fabland, as we call it. We have a paint correction specialist, we have a welder fabricator, and then myself, the engine builder and tuner. And the 3 of us are what we would kind of title as performance technicians, where we can do any number of bolt-on parts, but we do specialize in very one-off and custom things based on what the owner's budget and dream for that vehicle is. And then we have another 6 technicians that work in the dealership side, that these guys are the ones who check in the cars, do all the routine upkeep, timing belt services, head gaskets, whichever. And some of the more mild building, for example, they'll do wheels and coilovers and such. But if it's more technical than that, whether it's getting an aftermarket ECU, any welding or custom work, it comes back to the Fabland, as we call it, and we kind of take over the build mind state on that. So.
All right, so again, a bunch of stuff to dig into here a little bit. So for a start, coming from, obviously, we're outside of the US, just broadly, you've mentioned there this 25-year sort of line in the sand, and am I right in saying basically when the car is beyond 25 years of age, it's a free-for-all in terms of importing into the US, with the exception of the states that have more sort of stringent emission standards. So the right-hand drive element of these cars, not an issue?
Not an issue that we've ever seen. I mean, I own multiple right-hand drive vehicles, and they're all, legally titled and registered and street driven and insured. So, vast majority of our clientele is all throughout the United States. The continental 50 states. With the emissions stuff, basically that's a state added requirement for certain states, but the car technically is still federally legal to come here at age 25. So that's more so what keeps the cars from getting here is the physical birth date being turning 25 years old. But for it to be legal to operate in certain states has those additional requirements. So it's not illegal to own it. You can't drive it on, say, California streets unless it's emissions compliant.
Yeah, sure. I think on that basis of that 25-year rule, the US market is probably, and maybe Fast and the Furious as well, is responsible for that massive exponential growth we've seen in those GTR prices. Because like a number of years ago, I was pretty keen on buying a GTR, and back then I could have bought a really tidy one for what was about 20,000 New Zealand dollars back in the probably 15,000 US dollars, and now that same car would probably be maybe in the 110,000 New Zealand dollar vicinity. So it's definitely gone absolutely wild, unfortunately. So thanks for that.
It's been wild. Like, after actually working for an importer now, and we don't look at other importers as, say, competition. There are many across the United States that will bring in cars. We just strive to bring in quality cars. So it doesn't matter what it is. Like, now we're beyond just the Skyline. So we have the Toyota Chaser and the Soarer. We do a lot of the VIP style cars, the Toyota Crowns, the Nissan President, Toyota Century. Again, we're bringing in all kind of stuff. But then for our sports cars, we typically stick with the FD-RX-7, the Skylines, and the Supra. So we do a lot with those big three, and they are super popular here. So
you mentioned bringing in quality, and I'm interested to dive into this as well. What is the process of actually finding genuine, straight, accident-free, rust-free cars in Japan? How big a issue is the language barrier? Is it about having someone on the ground that is 100% trustworthy? I'm assuming you're not actually traveling to Japan to handpick these cars. Give us a little insight there into how that goes.
I would absolutely love to go handpick cars, just because I've been to Japan. I love it. But again, that's not very cost effective and wouldn't be very easy for a company like us to do such a thing. So, Chris plays the import game. I mean, like a master, Texas Hold'em player is kind of how I say it. He's got an eye for, quality vehicles. So the simplest thing that I say he does is he's looking at Japanese auctions, and they produce auction sheets, and they have vehicle grades, and they have some notes. So obviously those are not in English. So we'll use simple, Google Translate to kind of change those documents over to English so we can kind of get an idea of what it says on those forms. And he'll say, okay, this is a car that I'm interested in. But to answer your question, we do have somebody on the ground that's there full time, and he'll put together a list of vehicles that he wants to be checked out. And with working with that person, they know full well what type of vehicles Driver Motorsports is interested in importing. So, that person will then look at a vehicle and say, hey, look, this is not Driver Motorsports quality, and then they just throw off. They won't even look to that vehicle anymore. So it starts with just looking at the basic paperwork that anybody could really look at if they knew where to look, and then working with a broker over there or somebody that can handle that language barrier for you, someone that can, say, deregister a vehicle there and do the title export paperwork there, and then when it gets here and you have to go through US customs and all that. So it's a relatively lengthy process. I think by the time we purchase a vehicle, after going back and forth, say we want it at an auction, we're talking a couple of months, 2 to 3 months before it's here stateside, and then it's sitting in customs awaiting clearance, and then shipped to our facility in Virginia.
Coming back to the auction sheet, because anyone who sort of looked at Japanese auctions has probably seen one of these. And like you say, I mean, there's a bunch of information in Japanese, and they might sort of note any marks or imperfections on the paint. Generally, the first and sort of easiest thing to look at is the Japanese auction grade. And I mean, I'm definitely not sort of deep into this industry. From what I understand, that sort of grading goes up to 5, and 5, I believe, is basically essentially brand new showroom quality vehicle. So sort of maybe 4 or 4.5 grade, you're looking at a very, very good quality car. So I'm guessing that's a good place to start. But even if you're looking at grade 4 or better, is it still got the potential that there's some hidden rust, or it's been involved in an accident that you can't actually sort of see until you dive a little bit deeper? So that's where that person on the ground comes in to verify that it is in fact what you think you're bidding on.
That's absolutely right. So we do have the ability to run like the VIN numbers, and can kind of look at a vehicle history in Japan. That does cost money. So again, it's more of an investment, but we can run those VINs and find out if there's ever been a reported accident, which again is a big help. And it could still have a high grade where the car was reconditioned or rebuilt or repainted. But there are many a times where we'll see vehicles with a high grade and there is hidden rust, or there is, very terrible body work that's done. Or, for example, the chassis is in wonderful condition, but the engine is not so healthy. It lists the miles, if they're confirmed miles or not, because sometimes they'll change a cluster and it'll say non-verified. And again, we try to steer clear of those. And if we do end up getting one of those, we're a full disclosure, dealer. So we document that stuff, to great lengths to tell people that, hey, look, this is a non-verified miles vehicle. To the best of our ability, this is what we know it has, and it's over to the buyer to, take a look at the vehicle, make sure that it's what they want. But again, we try to avoid that at all costs. If it's something that's got some hidden snakes, we'll save ourselves the hassle and not get a vehicle like that. But it has happened recently where we've had vehicles show up here and they had high grades, low mileage, and literally was like a piece of like duct tape and then painted over, where it was rusted all the way through, and the photos just didn't show it. So I mean, it happens. We get those vehicles too, and then we just make a decision of, hey, are we going to put the time and money into doing a complete restoration on this thing to sell it and make peanuts, or are we going to sell it with full disclosure? And typically that's what we'll end up doing. We have a just arrived section that, hey, look, this is fresh off the boat, if you will. There's a lot of issues. There's a lot of damage. We're not going to look to fix it. We will if you want to pay us to. But if you buy this, buyer beware. It's got some stuff that needs to be taken care of.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's essential if you want to protect your reputation and name, which obviously is going to be so important to getting the quality of customer that you need to be dealing with these vehicles. I mean, I guess really the upshot of this is, all the best laid plans put into place and all of the sort of checks and balances along the way. Occasionally, I guess one is still going to slip through, and you could basically put that down to the cost perhaps of doing business. So it kind of is what it is. I just wanted to take a moment out of this interview with Josh and just talk about a course that I think you'd really appreciate if you are enjoying this podcast episode. With Josh, we've talked about EFI tuning and we've also talked about engine building. And I just wanted to highlight our practical engine building course. I know that a lot of enthusiasts, when they're building their own project car, tend to think that building their own performance engine is just beyond them. The reality is nothing could be further from the truth, and anyone with an eye for detail and a little patience can build and assemble your own performance engine. This course covers the fundamentals that you're going to need to understand. You'll learn about the parts inside the engine, the machining operations that you're going to need to have completed by a separate machinist. You're also going to learn all about the clearances inside the engine and how you may need to adjust factory clearances to suit your own performance engine build when you might be trying to make 2 or 3 times the factory power. From here, we move into a generic step-by-step process you can apply irrespective of the type of engine you're wanting to build. Might be a quad cam V12 or a pushrod 4-cylinder. It just doesn't matter. This process is 100% applicable. By breaking the entire engine building process down into 10 steps, each of those individual steps is relatively quick and easy to complete, and in no time you've got to the end, you've got a completely assembled engine, and you're going to have the confidence when it comes time to turn the key for the first time that it's going to start, it's going to run exactly as you'd expect, providing great power, great torque, and most importantly, great reliability. Moving on from this 10-step process, we also move into our library of worked examples, which is an informal walkthrough of that 10-step process where you can see it being applied to a variety of different engines to give yourself a wider level of knowledge on different engine platforms. This course is delivered via online video-based modules that you can take from anywhere in the world provided you've got an internet connection, meaning that you can learn from the comfort of your own place and you can learn at your own pace. Once you've purchased, it is yours for life. You can watch it as many times as you like, whenever you like. And we also offer a 60-day, no questions asked, money back guarantee. So if you purchase and for any reason at all decide it's not quite what you expected, let us know. We'll give you a full refund of the purchase price. Remember, if you aren't already an HPA member, you can use that coupon code podcast75. That'll get you $75 off the purchase of your very first HPA course, and we'll put a link to this course and that coupon code in the show notes. Let's get back to our chat with Josh now. Moving on, the build and tune side of the business, you've sort of suggested that this is sort of grown up more recently, obviously with 3 staff in that area of the business. You're a pretty pivotal part of that. Did you come into this with it fully developed? You sort of said at the start Chris was interested in employing you, but said he couldn't afford you. Did he build up this business once you were in, or did you sort of come into this with that side of the business already pretty developed and running?
I would say it was kind of in its infant stages. He had hired a engine builder and tuner prior to me that was big into the drag racing world, and he spent a lot of time on the road, and it seemed more like that was his more focus than say driver motorsports. So as the engine builder and tuner, for a company, you would think that, hey, this is home, I got to take care of home first. But this gentleman had lots of different things happening in his world and just didn't, I guess, seem to have the drive or desire to try to move to the next level. He was kind of content. I never met this gentleman, so I don't have any negatives to say, but he was there to get the dyno off the ground and to get driver motorsports recognized as a facility that could do engine builds and tuning. And so it definitely got it through its baby steps stages. So when I came in, that gentleman was no longer employed there, and the mechanic that was kind of filling that void was commuting more than like 2 hours away, one way. And it just wasn't economical for him to stay. So it was kind of, fate that I was walking in as those two gents were stepping out. And, given, my management background and the things that I was doing for the Navy, Chris kind of gave me like, this is my vision. This is what I want. Tell me what you think. And I mean, I even went as far as I wrote him an email with kind of like my mission and vision statements on what I think driver motorsports should be and could be with the right attitude and the right, intensity. And, met that with a big handshake and a big grin and was like, make it happen. So, I mean, to really answer that question is no, it wasn't fully developed, but it had an okay base.
Yeah.
We weren't in shambles, and, there was plenty of room for upward mobility, and which case, yeah, we've grown exponentially, even in just the last year that I've been on board. We have huge goals.
Okay. Let's dive a little bit deeper into the tuning side of your day-to-day for a start. And again, you've already sort of mentioned at this point, coming into this dyno facility, you'd really had no experience on a dyno. So how much of a learning curve was that for you, sort of jumping in the deep end with a rolling road dyno? And we'll talk about the dyno itself as well. I guess the other question is, how did that help fast track your knowledge and experience with tuning?
It certainly did. So I will say, and I mean, I have no shame in throwing the plugs out to you guys, that your courseware was a tremendous benefit to me. in the EFI tuning fundamentals and such because it reinforced knowledge that I already, had. And it also, I learned some new things along the way, especially when it comes to different platforms, whether it be, Haltech or Motech or, you pick the poison. I could watch those worked examples, but then also looking at the process and how things are laid out, it was very familiar, and it seemed to make a lot of sense. Well, when I watched the first segment of videos on tuning without a dyno, I was like, oh yeah, man, this is exactly what I didn't know that that's what I was doing, but that's what I was doing. I was following a process. So I had seen in your videos that, hey, using the dyno to potentially hold the vehicle back or to provide a load amount is going to help me to put tighter resolution into the tuning that I'm doing. And not only that, but see the repeatable results of I did this, it made more torque. I did this, it made more power. So the learning curve absolutely was there because it was a little intimidating with such a fancy piece of equipment, something that I know I couldn't afford to replace if I broke it. But also that I'm looking at, these cars that people are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on. I've got to worry about the car. I got to worry about the dyno. I got to worry about the facility. I mean, like there was just so much going on that, thankfully, I'm used to operating in intense pressure that, I'm not going to be shaken very easy, but I'm also, humble enough to tell you like, I'm a little afraid of doing this right now. I'm gonna baby step. So once I learned how to operate the dyno and what some of the base settings were and how to change some features on it, I got very comfortable with it very quickly. And I mean, it really just fell into place that I had a technical knowledge that how engines operate, how things work. I had a kind of a fallback where I had followed a lot of your training videos and seen how those things function and what response I should get. And then just seeing it in real time, I was able to, kind of leapfrog where I would have been had I just went out and purchased that equipment by myself.
Yeah, I think that's probably, again, mirrors my own experience. As I said, I got started with road tuning, and I still think that is an important skill set. And I mean, I think a lot of people now with dynos skip the road tuning portion. And I say this within our courses. I've said it here on the podcast before as well, but it bears repeating, is that it's very difficult, if not impossible, even with a very well-designed dyno cell to replicate the airflow and the temperatures that we will see once we've got that car out on the road or a racetrack at 60 or 100 miles an hour. And not being able to replicate those perfectly often will result in small discrepancies between what we see on the tune on a dyno versus the road. So my last step, once I've completed the tune on the dyno, will be to take the car out on the road or the racetrack, put it through its paces, and actually confirm that the air-fuel ratios are tracking what I want, the boost is doing exactly what it was doing on the dyno, we don't have any knock, and then I can give it a clean bill of health and say, yeah, under real-world conditions, this is doing exactly what I want it to do. Of course, when we're tuning on the road, well, we have no option. We're tuning under those exact conditions. So it goes without saying it will be what it will be. I think, though, the fast tracking of the learning, when you can do these back-to-back runs, you're seeing the exact change in terms of power and torque that you got for whatever you changed in the computer. That really does speed up your learning curve significantly, which is understandable. In terms of the dyno, obviously there's a number of brands and different styles of dyno on the market these days. Can you tell us what Driver Motorsports uses?
So we have a DynoJet. Basically, they got different varying model numbers. Some that are just as simple as like the inertia dyno, that's a rolling drum. This one has the eddy brake setups on it, and it's a all-wheel drive dyno. So we have the ability to, really tune anything: front-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive, all-wheel drive, and it's configurable in every facet.
Now, you just used two terms there, and I think at least DynoJet are well known for their inertia dynos. You've mentioned this one has the eddy current brake, what I often refer to as a load-bearing dyno. Can you just break down for us the differences between an inertia dyno and a load-bearing dyno?
Certainly. So my first experience messing with an inertia dyno was actually doing a emissions test. We were trying to check a vehicle out, and essentially they just call it the rolling road, and it doesn't have any real sensors or calibration or anything finicky like our DynoJet does. It simply knows the mass of that drum, the diameter, and when it spins at a certain speed, it understands, hey, by this gear ratio, this is how much torque it's making, and it convert that torque number into a horsepower number. So very cool system, but it doesn't apply any real load, in which case for us that are trying to do high power performance tuning, it would basically be like putting the car on jack stands and free revving it and expecting it to function, with zero load other than just gravity holding it back.
Sure. I mean, obviously, that large drum with a significant mass, it is applying a load, but it's not a variable or adjustable load. So, I mean, I think that the inertia dynos have their place. I've used them, and they're perfectly fine for doing a wide open throttle ramp run. Benefit, of course, as well, because as you say, there's not a lot of sort of sensors, there's not a lot of technology applied to these. It doesn't have a eddy current brake or a hydraulic brake. It doesn't have a load cell. It's just literally measuring the acceleration rate of this drum. So on that basis, relatively cost effective. But where I don't see any real benefit for use for them is when you're trying to do part throttle steady state tuning, because you really can't, correct?
That's right. So the ways I was doing it in the past, which again you've done a great job outlining in videos, is I would have to have somebody else operate a vehicle for me while I was at the helm of the laptop. But we were putting very like heavy duty strain on the car's braking system to be able to hold the car back. And in which case, if I'm, having to worry about bumps in the road, or if we're coming up on traffic or a stoplight, it just seemed like it took so much longer to tune a vehicle. And we were putting a lot more wear and tear on the car. And the risk of me damaging something was much higher, of course. Whereas with, the one we have with a brake system on it, I can basically tell the dyno, hey, 2,500 RPM is my stopping point, and no matter where I give my throttle input, it's going to hold the vehicle back to that 2,500 RPM. And we take it a step further and we calibrate the dyno to each vehicle. So we'll basically plug in what the gear ratio is, and the dyno then has a real computation of what the car's actually doing, more so beyond just that drum spinning at a predetermined rate.
Yeah. So essentially with that load-bearing dyno, as you've mentioned, the way that your particular dyno applies load is with an eddy current brake. And basically you program into the dyno, hey, I want 2,500 RPM. Obviously, depending on your gear ratio, the relationship between engine RPM and the roller speed is going to vary. But once it knows what that roller speed is, again, you can come up on that with 10% throttle and just barely hold the car at 2,500 RPM. The dyno will be applying almost no load. But then at the same time, you could go to wide open throttle. Maybe you've got 20 PSI of boost. Maybe the engine's making 800 horsepower, probably not at 2,500 RPM, but for the purposes of our conversation, the dyno simply applies more and more load to maintain that roller speed, irrespective of how much torque that is being transferred into the roller. So allows that proper steady state tuning of fuel and ignition. That's become so much more important as our ECUs have become more sophisticated, and it's that stuff that I think a lot of tuners overlook. And within reason, it's actually pretty easy to tune a car under wide open throttle ramp run conditions. I mean, particularly if we take turbos or superchargers out of the equation, basic naturally aspirated engine, I could probably dial that in under wide open throttle ramp run conditions in maybe 4 or 5 pulls, and I'm going to be there or thereabouts. But getting the car to idle, to cold start, and then all of this mid-range part throttle stuff to drive smoothly, transition nicely, that's the stuff that outside of a competition drag car really makes or breaks, whether the tune is good. And most people aren't going to be able to tell the difference of sort of 4 or 5 horsepower at the wheels at 7,000 RPM wide open throttle, but I can guarantee if your mixture's way too rich or way too lean at 3,000 RPM part throttle, you are absolutely going to notice that. On that basis, and hopefully your experience here mirrors mine, what sort of percentage time do you think you put in general with wide open throttle versus part throttle tuning?
I think I spend a vast majority of my time doing the steady state tuning itself. I'll set a car up for its, base map from a fresh build, and we'll make sure that it's up on temperature. We're not leaking and causing any issues before I bring the car to the dyno. But I'll roll through steady state tuning. I'll spend roughly 45 minutes to an hour, depending on, dyno temperatures and vehicle temperatures and things like that, working my way up, through a percentage of the rev range about as high as I can safely go without really trying to beat the car up too bad. And then I'll interpolate the upper levels and put it in a safe, fuel and timing range. And I want to say between, 3 to 5, big wide open throttle pulls, I typically see, oh, this is where we're at. This is what I need. Data logging has come a long way, so I can essentially watch back in real time and do all my tuning without even having to put the engine under stress to recreate those areas that may be, rich or lean based on, what the dyno load is giving me at that given percentage.
Now, I'm interested to hear your experience as well with some of the more high-powered cars. I've gone through a sort of a full circle here. I started out using a Dynapack hub dyno, which is a New Zealand-made brand. Great dyno, but I was finding with the higher horsepower drag cars that I was tuning at the time, the hub torque limit was really holding me back. And I mean, any Dynapack owners would probably have experienced the red screen of death where it over torques and shuts down. Then when we started High Performance Academy, we went to a mainline rolling road. We started 2-wheel drive, went 4-wheel drive. Great dyno, very easy to set up as well, particularly quick and easy for relatively low-powered cars. And then we sort of transitioned into Mainline's newer Pro Hub dyno. So I've sort of gone hub dyno, rolling road, back to the hub dyno. One of the things I did find when I was dealing with the rolling road is that the dyno is very sensitive to strapping technique and also sensitive to tyre pressure, tyre temperature, and even the type of tyre fitted in order to get back-to-back consistent and repeatable results. And I found that a little bit frustrating. Can you talk to us about that a little bit? Is that similar to your experience?
That is absolutely the same. So our dyno facility is completely indoors. I mean, we have a roll-up door that I'll keep cracked so we have exhaust blasting outside and not inside the bay that we're working in. But it's relatively, I'll say climate controlled in there. So, while we're putting the car through its paces, obviously engine heat, exhaust heat, everything is going to be climbing in temperature, in which case it's going to take the ambient air up. And that alone is going to change, the dynamics of my tuning environment. If I spend too many times ramping the car, I'd notice I got to take a lot more time, let the car cool back down. And, that's just a whole headache in its own. But one thing I do notice is exactly what you're talking about with the tires, with the way the vehicle is strapped down. Oftentimes we have vehicles that are very, very low, and it makes it difficult for us to strap these cars down because we're trying not to damage intricate bodywork. There's lots of carbon fiber panels. There's things that just, if I strap it down, I'm going to break something else or put an unnecessary load on, say, a control arm or a suspension arm that most of these are, aluminum, that we could risk bending if the car was to sway or move. So what I've noticed is that, depending on the dyno temperature, we'll see anywhere from, 60 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit when we're starting, and then we'll be up in the 80s and 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And then I have a meter that I put a temperature sensor on the tire, and I'll see the tire temp start to go through the roof. And in certain tire brands, they get more grippy. And I notice that I don't have any wheel spin on the dyno. Whereas a car with a more like DOT street type tire, we start hitting 7, 8, 900 plus horsepower. The tires just break loose. There's nothing we can do, no matter how tight we strap it down or how much air we let out. And we know that our numbers are going to be skewed as a result of that. So, I mean, it is something that we see regularly, given that majority of the cars that come to us for builds and tunes, most don't leave less than 500 horsepower.
Yeah. And obviously the wheel spin element does become a bigger concern as those power figures do increase. So that's something that is a given with a rolling road, and strapping technique has a big impact on doing the best of getting that power to the rollers. But at some point, you're literally just asking too much. So obviously at that point, the hub dyno does come into its own in terms of the repeatability and just being able to get a power figure in the first place. One thing I really tried to do, and this was sort of brought home to me because we had our own test vehicle that was going on the dyno maybe 2-3 times a week for webinars. And, because I was dynoing it literally just about every day of the week, you knew what the thing should produce. And you could really see the differences between how I strapped it down, the tire pressures, and even through a long dyno session, as you mentioned, the tire temperature comes up and that would affect it. So that made me very sensitive to that. What I found as a professional tuning workshop was you'd always get customers that would come in, you tune the car, maybe find the next limit and then send them on their way. And then 6 months or a year later, they'd come back and they've fixed that bottleneck and they want to go further. And with those customers, that repeatability becomes even more important because, they left your dyno with 550 wheel horsepower, 6 months ago. They come back in, you put it back on the dyno and do a baseline, and all of a sudden it's down 30 horsepower. And that always sort of starts to raise a bit of an eyebrow. Okay, well, is something wrong here? Have we got an issue with the engine? Is something starting to sort of go away? Or is it just run-to-run variation or day-to-day variation? I mean, obviously that's a huge variation, but we did see this, and I'll bring it back home with an example we had. This was probably the most extreme I've seen. We had a Z01 Camaro with a supercharged LSA engine in it that we were using for some worked examples on our rolling road mainline, and I'd basically got all but to the end of that worked example, and foolishly, this really needs to be a pre-dyno check. Nearing the end of the worked example, I happened to have a look at the rear tyres, and both of them were showing steel belts on the inside edge. Obviously, pretty far from ideal, and I'll kick myself here because, as I say, I should have picked this up. It didn't happen as a result of the tuning. They were just pretty worn when the car came into us. And of course, I don't want to risk a blowout, so I rang up the owner and said, "Hey, look, these tyres are rinsed. Can we get some new tyres on it?" He said, "Yeah, actually, as it happens, I've got a pair of new tyres sitting here." Long story short, swapped the tyres out, put it back on the dyno, strapped it back down exactly the same way, ran it up again, and I can't remember specifically, but we were significantly down on power, maybe as much as 30 or 40 horsepower. And it was literally just the difference. These brand new tyres were so sticky. You could tell just pressing your fingernail into them compared to these old, hard as hell tyres that had no tread left on them. And these are the sort of things that I find, you really need to understand the implications, and then it also comes down to education for the customer. I've said again this before on the podcast, but again it bears repeating. I use the dyno as a comparative tool. While yes, if you've got the same car coming back, the repeatability is nice. Really, what we're still looking at is the before, in terms of when we put the car on the dyno, what's it making? We finish our tuning, we add our parts, what's it making then? That's really the key thing we want to take away, and that kind of also takes the internet bragging rights between different brands out of the equation as well, at least as I see it. Anyway, I think probably done strapping technique to death, but I will just also reiterate your point about these low cars with flat underfloors. It's getting increasingly difficult to strap them down, and the argument I always hear from rolling road owners is, they're so quick compared to a hub dyno to get the car strapped down. And I think as time goes on, that argument's actually holding less and less weight with me anyway. In terms of the rest of your dyno facility, because I think when people are looking at, okay, I'm gonna buy a dyno, that's my main cost. The reality is, as I see it, that's probably about 50% of the cost, because we also need a facility to run it in. We need fans, we need extraction fans, and then we need tools. So can you talk to us a little bit about the bigger picture of the facility that you're operating in?
Absolutely. So the company had grown so much so fast that they built an entire whole other building with the mindset that, hey, we're going to put a dyno in, we're going to put some extra lifts in. And at that point, if you were to look back at the YouTube videos, it was just a steel building, concrete floor with a pit dug for the dyno to go in. And it was just open, wide open space in there. And then once the dyno was installed, it was kind of like blank canvas. So initially it was just an open room with a dyno in it where we positioned some blower fans out front with the roll up door, and tuning was tuning. As we've, increased our capacity, the look means as much to us now as the quality of product that you get out of there. So, now when you walk into our facility and you look, it's not just a dyno. There's, like wall mounted cabinets that are color matched to fit company logos, and they match the machinery. And we have, very nice, just kind of layout. So when you look at it, you're like, oh, this is a nice, nice facility. Well, inside of all those cabinets, you can stow away the tools, the computer system that operates the dyno, all of the fans plug away. So essentially, when the room is not being used, it's just a flat dyno facility, you know. But again, we went to great lengths to make sure that, you know, hey, this is a beautiful layout. It looks good, but everything is functional. Everything has its place to really just kind of add to that professional environment that, hey, you bring your car here to get tuned. It's not just slapped on, you know, something in the backyard and we do what we do. So
I think there's a saying that how you do anything is how you do everything. And while on face value, having a nice, tidy facility doesn't necessarily mean you're getting a better quality of tune, but I think it just portrays that professionalism. And if you've got a professional looking facility, everything's tidy in its place, chances are that's going to give the customer more confidence that the job that they're going to get is also going to match that level of professionalism. So I think that's really important when you are trying to sell yourself to a customer. Obviously, over the time you've been interested in cars, we've seen a significant improvement in the quality of aftermarket ECUs. Now, obviously, people listening to this podcast can't see the fact that you're wearing a Haltech t-shirt in this chat that we're having. Haltech, I'm going to guess on that basis, is one of your brands of preference. What other ECUs have you sort of gravitated towards using at Driver Motorsports?
we've not been, I'll say, brand loyal to an extent where when customers have their preference, that's the management system that we will use. So again, I'm not simply going to tell somebody, hey, I'm not going to tune your car because, you know, you're not running X brand. It just seems that at the time of my working at Driver Motorsports, the dominant number of vehicles coming through were a Haltech platform. And I got familiar with it very quickly. And if I needed any support, the customer support was phenomenal. So it kind of turned us into, I would say, we're not necessarily a Haltech exclusive shop, but that is my go-to platform, being that it is the one that I am the most familiar with now. But we've worked with Link, we've worked with AEM. I've very few Motec systems have come through. I think that the US is now catching wind of how phenomenal of a system that is. You know, it just, I think it's all about kind of bang for the buck when it comes here. People are willing to spend as much as they're willing to spend, but in most cases, it's some of the Link ECUs and some of the more, I hate to call them entry level, but they have, you know, the base platform, the base tuning software, and you can plug it in and just go. But the need for peripheral add-ons gets really expensive, whereas companies like Motec and Haltech, a lot of that is, those features are built in. And that tends to be what works the best for us, is that the need to expand based on the car is easier done with a brand like Haltech.
Yeah. I mean, there's no argument that Haltech has done a great job of marketing their product and have got really good brand awareness and brand loyalty just about all across the world these days. Just to come back to the point you made, because I think I'll probably actually disagree a little on this in terms of tuning just about anything that comes in the door. And I think probably I did start in that same direction when I formed Speedtech Motorsports, because, you know, basically I needed the business. So if someone came to me with XYZ brand of ECU that I wasn't familiar with, I would definitely book it in for a tune. And I think as I sort of matured and as we got a little bit more sort of loyalty with our customer base and a bit more brand awareness, I tended to gravitate down towards sort of a base selection of ECUs. And what we've done is sort of, you know, on the, again, I use the same term, entry level, and it's not really fair because the likes of Haltech and Link ECU, which we were big advocates for, those are definitely not what I would call entry level ECU in terms of they're not stripped out of features. They are very fully featured ECUs that will do an amazing job, but they do not have maybe some of the high level motorsport functionality that the likes of maybe a Motec M1 or a Life Racing ECU has these days. So different price points, different markets, but we kind of gravitated towards maybe 3 or 4 different systems that we knew would cover the feature set that our customers wanted, the price points that they wanted, and we could do a really good job with those brands. And the reason I say that is because every brand, the ECU, in essence, when it all comes down to the bare bolts of it, they all work essentially in the same way. But there is a user interface that you need to learn. There's the shortcuts, there's the way they do certain functionality, and you need to learn all of those little nuances of every brand. That simply takes time. So if I'm faced with something that I've never used before, maybe the highest level Bosch Motorsport ECU, all singing, all dancing, maybe something in the sort of €10,000 plus vicinity, that's the best of the best. If that ECU is brought to me, I would be able to provide a better quality tune on a Haltech than I could on that Bosch Motorsport ECU, because I know the Haltech inside and out. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. And it's not about shoehorning your customer in a certain direction because you get to make a bigger cut on selling that product. That's almost never what it should be about, or never what it is about. From the honest, good level operators, it's more about, this is the product that I think fits your criteria, and I'm going to be able to give you the best result in a minimal time frame, hence it's going to save you money. So that was kind of my philosophy on it. And I know there's different schools of thought. So you look on enthusiast forums and there's always arguments about certain shops trying to sell only one brand of ECU, but I think more often than not, that's a misunderstanding on the part of the enthusiast, thinking why the shop's doing that is to make more money, where the result is often just to get a better finished product for the user. Do you sort of agree with that?
I absolutely do. And what you said kind of echoes, now that I really think about it, is when we were working to develop, Driver Motorsports as a premier tuning and build shop, we were looking to book those dyno appointments and to make sure that machine is getting operated, because it's a cost. We're paying for it whether we're using it or not, and obviously we need to pay for that equipment.
You want that return on your investment for sure.
We need to keep it rolling. So again, I'd be tuning things, for example, using the HP Tuner software with a lot of the Corvettes that come in. We've even had trucks come in with some of the piggyback bully dog type things. But again, I kind of reflected on what you said, and I'm the same sentiment in that it is not my favorite thing to do, because I do have to learn those nuances. And, there has been times where, somebody brings a car in for a tune. This is not a car that I built. It's not a car, like, this is somebody did this in their own garage, but they lack the ability to tune. They bring it to me to finish it. And here I am struggling because I'm unfamiliar with their engine. I'm unfamiliar with their tuning software. And it's the worst when, again, these folks want to stay on the property while I'm going to attempt to tune this vehicle. And, it's frustrating to have to tell them, like, hey, look, can you drop the car off? I'm going to have it for a week. I'll give it back to you, around this timeline. But I'm very, like, full disclosure. I'll typically will tell, hey, look, this is not an engine that I'm super familiar with. This is not a platform that I use regularly. I'm gonna do the best I can with what I have. And I usually tend to tell people that, I consider myself a very conservative tuner. I'm not looking, for those horsepower numbers. I think at my age now, I'm beyond that. Like, I want to know how much power it makes, but it's not as important to me as a well-running, piece of equipment that's not going to come back to me for extra service.
Yeah, and I think the joy of the extra 8 or 10 horsepower on the dyno sheet is very quickly forgotten when the rod windows the side of the block on your first full power pass up the street. So yeah, I think being conservative is never a bad thing when it comes to tuning customer engines. I mean, obviously, if it's competition or you're tuning your own thing, maybe you want to fly a little bit closer to the sun, but in general, it doesn't normally end that well. Just to go back to the different brands of ECU as well, and I'm not going to name names here, the other thing I ended up finding was there are a handful of different ECUs that came through our doors over the years, and for one reason or another, I just decided outright, I am not tuning this brand of ECU. I did not feel that I could provide a quality tune that matched my expectations using that particular platform. So rather than take the customer's money and provide what I considered to be a second-rate result, we just flat out refused. And I think that's, again, it's a bitter pill to swallow, particularly when you're getting started, because obviously you need that dyno working. You want to make money off it. But if you look at the big picture, the problem is when you provide the best quality tune that you can and you're limited by the product, that customer goes away and the car's an absolute dog to drive under part throttle. The acceleration enrichment, just you can't get that right. So it's horrible and unresponsive. It won't cold start. It won't idle. The customer is going to always point the finger at the tuner, even if they've been told this is a limitation with the ECU. It always does tend to come back to the tuner's fault. And as soon as those people start talking, or God forbid, jump on forums, straight away, it's your reputation that gets slammed. So I think you do have to look at the big picture sometimes. Swallow that pill and just say outright, look, I'm sorry, this isn't a brand that we feel can do an adequate job, so we won't cover it here. All right, I'll move on. We're probably getting a little bit long here, but there is one more topic I did want to just briefly touch on, which is engine building. And I guess this sort of does dovetail quite nicely back into your experience in the Navy dealing with fighter jets, because again, precision, you're obviously used to working at a high level. But again, how did you build those skills to sort of build a performance engine as opposed to everyday garden variety street car engine?
When I first got into engine building, it was again one of those, like, something broke, I had to fix it, and I couldn't afford to just take it to some shop somewhere. I literally got a hold of an engine that was damaged, started taking it apart, put it on a stand, and for lack of better language, I was just dissecting it, just trying to figure out what happened. And it was easy enough to see that, oh, this one's just got some damaged piston rings and a little bit of scratches here and there. I can just replace these parts and put it back together, and it'll work. And that is kind of a watered down version of what was actually entailed in that. But then I learned very quickly that, hey, this is fun. I like doing this. And I was no stranger of having friends that had gotten cars that they'd pushed them too hard, too fast, no lift mentality, and just broken engines all over the place. And I told the guys, hey, I'll charge you what the parts are plus a little bit, and I'll put it together in my garage. And I had phenomenal success with that. Then when it came to my own engines, it was like, all right, well, I know I'm pushing this one to the complete breaking point. Do I want to let it break and then try to save it, or do I want to go ahead and go in now? And that's really where it took off with doing some of these high horsepower, precision builds, is that I did the research and figuring out what pistons I wanted to go with, whether it be H beam or I beam, or kind of heck with what brand at this point. I started learning about compression ratios and what bearing clearances were, and before you know it, I was just slapping stuff together. And every single time, first turn of the key, the engine fired and sounded wonderful, and never had one of those engines come back to me. So it was just one of the best blessings to be able to have a skill set and be fearless enough to just dive into it and think about it like, well, what's the worst that can happen? It's already broken. So.
In terms of building these engines, you're dealing obviously with Japanese domestic market engines. And I mean, there's a number of different engines you've mentioned, or car platforms we've talked about during this podcast. But if I just dive back into one specifically, which is the R32 GTR, well, really with the RB26, we're talking 32, 33, and 34. This is an engine that, again, as we're talking about the whole platform, I think has achieved legendary status, yet is actually, in modern terms, a fairly, how would you put it? I wouldn't say a poor engine design. It is a flawed engine design in that there's a lot of things that we have to overcome and fix if you want to take that engine and make it reliable at 8 to 9,000 RPM and maybe sort of 900 plus horsepower. There's a lot of things that need changing. However, I guess at this stage, coming into these vehicles, you've got the benefit of looking at what the rest of the world has already learned the hard way. Was this a blessing in disguise that you could learn from what everyone else had been doing and what parts needed to be replaced?
Absolute fact. So just having the car here in my hands, there's so much learning that could be done. But again, now you're introducing trial and error, where I have to make mistakes or see a given fault to know what I'm going to do with that. Whereas with the blessing of the internet and YouTube and guys like what was Motive DVD back in the day, but now Motive Video, showing all of the tech tips and Herman from Platinum Racing Products, and the technical insight that they produce, I'm able to really learn from other people's mistakes. And that was a big part of, my military training, is that on the job training from technicians that had far more years of experience than me, could tell me, hey, look, you could do this 30 minutes quicker, but this is typically going to be your result. Follow the technical manual, play by the rules, things are going to work great. And
Don't take shortcuts.
that's it. That's just, don't cheat yourself, because somebody's going to pay for it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a big fan, wherever possible, of learning from others' mistakes, because it is a much cheaper way of learning rather than having to repeat all of those same mistakes yourself. The other element I found as well, and this really fast-tracked my learning on the 4G63 platform when we had our drag engine program, and that I had myself and about 2 other customers that were sort of operating at that 1,000 plus wheel horsepower level, and these engines are running on methanol. They're fairly highly tuned, and we would be cycling through these engines once every season, bringing them back in for a freshen up. And the benefit that gave us was being able to see what the engine was looking like internally after a season of drag racing at that power level. You'd start to see what parts were showing signs of deterioration. One of the piston designs I had, you'd see after a season that it would start cracking down the sides of the pin bosses. So that let us know that we were at the limit. I mean, if we'd run that piston for probably another season, maybe even another drag meeting, it might have torn the wrist pin out of the piston, and obviously that's going to destroy the entire engine. So I think that benefit, really seeing firsthand what parts needed upgrading and at exactly what point, that really fast-tracked our knowledge on that engine, which unfortunately is something that most people don't get to experience. Normally you sort of put an engine back together, it goes out the door, and you never hear from that customer again unless it blows up, at which point it's probably too late anyway. So, did you agree with that sort of ability to fast-track your learning?
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, seeing where failures are, and, almost a build recipe, for example, like you could just see that, especially going back to my magazine reading days, people would itemize all the list of everything that they put into a build. And you could almost just replicate that 100% by buying those parts, putting them in that engine, and achieving the same objectives. So that's the good side of it. But then, of course, the bad side is, hey, we start pushing these engines beyond, 600-700 horsepower. We start to see, blocks cracking, and, then you just, hey, do you have the financial pocket to add in the things that are required to stop that?
Yeah, that can get very expensive very quickly. Last thing I'll talk about on this point as well is factory workshop manuals. I'm a big advocate when it comes to building an engine. One of the first things you want to do is source a copy of the factory workshop manual, which fortunately with the internet these days, unless you're dealing with something that's essentially brand new off the showroom floor, it's usually not very difficult to access one of those manuals for free. That's going to give you service procedures, and some engines are pretty straightforward when it comes to understanding how it's going to come apart or how it's going to go together. Others, if you don't do things in a specific order, you're likely to have problems with valve to piston contact, for example. Clearances are another big element of these factory workshop manuals, but of course the clearances that you'll use in a garden variety production engine that's maybe designed to produce 300 horsepower, 400 horsepower, we might need to vary these when we're taking that same engine and now running another 1,000 RPM higher in the rev range and maybe doubling or tripling the power. So how do you use that sort of base guideline from the factory workshop manual versus what you'll actually end up gravitating towards in terms of bearing clearances, for one example?
Thankfully, as a dealership, we have access to websites and things where we can pull factory service manuals in, and they're already translated to English, and that'll give us all the sequences and the stuff you're talking about, like do this in this order, torque this in that order. And then we rely heavily on our aftermarket components that'll tell us like what the uprated torque specs would be as a result of using a different piece of hardware or something made of a different material, for example. So we always we lean heavily on the factory service manual to kind of give us that baseline of, hey, this is what it would be stock. Now, if it's in this realm stock, yeah, we're looking at 300-400 horsepower, but now we're going to, essentially double or triple that number. The clearances need to be much tighter. in which case we'll use the factory knowledge, but then take it to the extreme using dial bore gauges and micrometers and take those measurements, to a much tighter level, and then determine the clearance based on the application, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Josh, I think we'll move towards wrapping this thing up. I could probably talk for another hour and a half, but we do appreciate your time and want to respect that. So we'll finish up with the same 3 questions we ask all of our guests. And the first of those is, what's next in the future for you personally, as well as Driver Motorsports potentially?
So for myself, I'm still building that R32 GTR. We have a big event happening here in March, depending on when this cast comes out. This vehicle that I'm building now is scheduled to be out on track and showing people what we can do by way of my personal car, but kind of as a shop car. Driver Motorsports has partnered with the SCCA, the Sport Car Club of America, and we're looking at getting into some time trials and some other stuff. So we're going to have more of a track presence coming soon. And then I personally have some goals on the drag strip to attempt at taking the North American Skyline quarter-mile record. And depending on how that goes, I'm looking to attack one of the world records.
Wow. Where is the North American record sit at the moment?
So I want to say we're in like the 855 range. And again, some of these cars are auto, some of them are sequential. Mine is still a H pattern box. So again, that is more specific to what I'm hunting for. So there are definitely some fast cars in North America. But yeah, we think we have a recipe to knock some of them off the top.
Oh, exciting. I look forward to seeing how you progress with that. Next question, Josh, have you got any advice you'd give to a younger version of yourself to maybe help fast track where you've got to in your career? And I mean, this could be a bit of an interesting question for you, given that you've had quite a wide variety of experience between the Navy and now what you're doing.
I would probably just, kind of echo the never give up. There was some times in my life in the earlier years that cars weren't going to be the answer for everything, that they were probably more of a problem. I would imagine I would be much further along in my automotive career had I not taken a different path. But at that time, again, I won't say that I quit, but it was kind of don't give up. That's the mentality that I would really want to give myself.
Look, I think you probably need to give yourself some credit there, because the way you've sort of told that story, you're in a position where financially you weren't able to pursue an automotive career at that point in your life, and you've looked at the armed forces as a viable alternative to essentially get paid to learn these skills. So, obviously that expanded into a 20 plus year career, but, notwithstanding, you've built that skill set on the government's dime and probably had some amazing experiences along the way as well. So I guess adding to that, look at the big picture. There's often alternatives. If you really have your heart set on something, you'll find a way to achieve it. And if not, you'll probably find excuses not to. Last question for today, Josh. If people want to follow you and see what you're up to, how are they best to do so?
Easiest way to get a hold of us is Driver Motorsports at Gmail if they wanted to reach out about builds and services. Our website, drivermotorsports.com. And give us a like. We're on all the social medias, the Instagrams, the YouTubes, and Facebook.
Perfect. We'll put some links to all of those in the show notes to make it super easy for people to find you and follow you. Look, great to chat today, Josh. Really interesting to get what has been, over the course of this podcast, quite an unusual take on how you've got to where you have in your career. So really appreciate you chatting with us. And again, look forward to seeing what you can achieve with your own personal GTR as time goes by.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. If you enjoyed this episode of Tuned In with Josh, we'd love it if you could drop a review on your chosen podcasting platform. These reviews really help us to grow our audience, and that in turn helps us to continue to get more high quality guests. To say thanks, each week we'll be picking a random reviewer and sending them out an HPA t-shirt free of charge anywhere in the world. Also, this is a great place to ask any questions you might have too, and I'll do my best to answer them if your review gets picked. So this week, a big shout out to Frank at Elegant Drift Shop joining us from Canada, who has said, the best automotive podcast period. Tuned In from HPA is packed with valuable information coming from many key players in the industry. Not only is the technical information accurate, but they take it even further and also cover the business side of things and the steps the guests took to make it to where they are. Thanks for your feedback there, Frank, and I do recognize your name. You're a long-term HPA member, and I have seen you pop up in our webinars from time to time, so really appreciate your support over the years, Frank. And if you get in touch with your t-shirt size and shipping details, we'll fire a fresh tee off straight out to you. All right, that concludes our interview, and before we sign off, I just wanted to mention, for anyone who's been perhaps hiding under a rock and hasn't heard of High Performance Academy before, we are an online training school, and we specialize in teaching a range of performance automotive topics, everything from engine tuning and engine building through to wiring, car suspension and wheel alignment, data analysis, and race driver education. Now remember, you've got that coupon code. You can use podcast75 at the checkout to get $75 off the purchase of your first course. You'll find our full course list at hpacademy.com/courses. Important to mention that when you purchase a course from us, that course is yours for life as well. It never expires. You can rewatch the course as many times as you like, whenever you like. The purchase of a course will also give you 3 months of access to our Gold membership. That gives you access to our private members only forum, which is the perfect place to get answers to your specific questions. You'll also get access to our regular weekly members webinars, which is where we touch on a particular topic in the performance automotive realm. We dive into that topic for about an hour. If you can watch live, you can ask questions and get answers in real time. If the time zones don't work for you, that's fine too. You're going to get access as a Gold member to our previous webinar archive. We've got close to 300 hours of existing content in that archive. It is an absolute goldmine. So remember that coupon code podcast75. Check out our course list at hpacademy.com/courses.